Hey, hello. Today we are talking about passive vulnerability versus active vulnerability. So often, lately, this is like what I'm hearing constantly from people. The word vulnerable is becoming a word, a word that almost is losing meaning because it is being used so much. And a huge thing that's coming up for people around vulnerability is there are some people who really see vulnerability as a bad thing. You hear them say, if I were to say, hey, just, be more vulnerable, right? That would be really triggering for some people. I think men are especially triggered by this, or people in like professional workplaces can be really triggered by the word vulnerable. Vulnerable does not necessarily speak to a state of being that people actually want to dip into. And that is why I believe a better word that we could be using in place of vulnerability is the word courage. And the reason I'm calling this active vulnerability and passive vulnerability is because there's vulnerability and there's courage, and they are the same thing, and they're also not exactly the same thing. So courage, I think, is what active vulnerability actually is. So when I say passive vulnerability, what I mean is this word that kind of freaks people out, that vulnerable, like I don't want to be vulnerable. I think people think it means weak, unguarded, unprotected. You could be attacked at any moment. When you say that, children are vulnerable, or victims of abuse are vulnerable, or whatever it is, we don't have a good sense about that word. But really, what it is, vulnerability, is when we are feeling scared because we want to show up as we are, and we want to share our true selves, and we want to speak our truth, and we want to show up in relationship differently than we've been showing up in relationship, and we don't want to keep doing the same patterns that we've been doing, and we maybe want to talk to our parents about how hard that was when we were a kid and see if we could find some solid ground in which we could heal, or whatever it is for you. And that is very vulnerable, because you are choosing not to protect yourself. You're choosing not to guard your heart. You're choosing to bring your heart out of this cage that you have put it in, and actually bring it out into the light, let it breathe, and let yourself be free from this cage as well. That's vulnerable, because you've been hurt and you've been scared of getting hurt more. That's vulnerable. That feels vulnerable. Just the thought of it feels vulnerable. That's kind of passive. To be passive in that, to be passive in the feeling of fear. And then there's the act of courage, which is actually acting on choosing vulnerability. When you choose to make yourself vulnerable, that is an act of courage. When you choose to show up differently in the relationship, when you choose to say the thing that you've been silent on, when you choose to let your authentic, true self be seen, heard, and giving yourself the opportunity for other people to show up for you and love you and prove to yourself that you are lovable and valuable and worthy just as you are, that takes courage, because it takes action in order to do that. It's active vulnerability. It is choosing to make yourself, to put yourself in a vulnerable position. But let's be honest. Is it really vulnerable, or is it just you getting back to your heart's natural state of being? Sit with that for a minute. I did a post earlier today. Your heart is like a wild animal. It is not meant to be caged. It is meant to be free. It can be trusted. It is innocent. Your heart is not a danger to anyone. It's more of a danger when you keep it guarded and protected and safe and in its cage. That's when it starts to really become toxic and you start to feel isolated and alone and all this stuff. And now I'm going into all kinds of other things. But my point is, the heart was meant to be living freely out in the open. So when we talk about vulnerability, we're really talking about courage. Courage to step out of our cages, to stop guarding and protecting ourselves, to stop blocking ourselves from connection, and to be who we are, to stop hiding. So I just wanted to talk about that today. I don't necessarily have a point or a call to action or anything like that. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know how this lands. This is always a conversation that I want to be having. I'm Jessica Amos. I'm a meditation and mindfulness teacher. I'm a life transformation coach, and I'm the founder of Stay With Yourself, which is the practice of being who you are, where you are. And that takes courage, especially when most of us were taught that who we are is not good enough and we should sit back, shut up, and do what we're told, right? So being who you are, where you are, is super courageous. I commend you. I celebrate you. I'm right here with you, sending you all the love. Stay with yourself today and always.